Hi everyone. I wanted to pop on to show you a tool that I absolutely love in Inkscape, and I use it all the time. It's useful for me and I hope it's useful for you. The tool is called the Measure Path tool, and it can be located under the Extensions menu item. Then go to Visualize Path, then go to Measure Path. What this tool does is it displays the measurements of a path as an object. In other words, you can measure and store those measurements for a particular part of a pattern piece. In this case, I have used the tool on just this section of the neckline. It tells me how long that section of the neckline is, and then it stores this information as sort of an object. I can keep this object or I can delete it by clicking delete on my keyboard. It has some really great purposes. I use this to measure fit. So let's say I'm wanting to know how long a side seam is to know whether or not I need to lengthen or shorten it. I can just trace out the side seam and it'll give me that measurement. I do the same thing for end seams. I'm also finding that a very common use for me is when I'm mashing up patterns. And what that means is that often I'm wanting to take a pattern piece from one pattern and use it as a pattern piece in a different pattern. So combining patterns. For instance, maybe I have a hood pattern piece in another pattern that I want to see if it's compatible with the neckline of this pattern. All I would need to do is measure it out and then measure the other pattern piece to see if they're approximately the same length. Another use I can imagine for this is if you're wanting to calculate the length that you need for a neckband piece. You could take the measurements from both the back and the front neckline and then do your calculations from there rather than using your flexible ruler to measure it out by hand. So there is like a bit of a trick to using this. If I was just to select this pattern piece, which is a front bodice pattern piece, if I was to just select it, I would, and run that tool on it, I would get the measurement for the parameter of the entire pattern piece. And that's not super useful for me. In this case, I just wanted to know the neckline. So in order to get just a small part of a pattern piece, what I do is I use the pen tool. And I've already gone ahead and done it here. And you'll see that I've drawn out an approximation of the neckline here. I use the Bezier pen tool over here. It's kind of blue on the left-hand side. It allows me to draw curves and straight lines, which is perfect for this instance. I will click at the top of the neckline near the shoulder edge. Doesn't really matter where you start. And I'll click and I'll drag a little bit. By dragging a little bit, that actually allows you to make curves. It'll give you handlebars. I'll show you what that means in a second. But click and drag a little bit in order to later create curved paths. And I'll do the same thing at the very end of my neckline. I'll click and drag a little. And by dragging, I get these, like I said, the handlebars. And that allows me to move it like this. The pen tool does take a little bit of practice to get used to and to get good at. It took me a while to adapt to it, but once I did, I found it pretty intuitive, and now it doesn't take much effort. But don't be surprised if you find yourself a little confused by this tool at first, if it's your first time. And so I'm actually pretty happy with this curve. Oh, and by the way, I only need those 2 points in my line, and so even though it's kind of giving me a tail here where I can add another point, if I just want to end at those 2 points, I can hit enter and it will end that line. I'm calling them points, but the technical language is actually nodes. These are called nodes in Inkscape, and you'll see if I hover over them, they turn red, but they're the same as like points along a line. And if I go up here to my edit paths tool right here, it'll allow me to directly select any of those points or nodes. And when I select it, I'll see the handlebars. So if I needed to make additional edits to this line, I could do so. But I'm actually pretty happy with it. So instead, I could leave it in place and run the Measure Path tool as is, or I could go up here and select the Transform tool just to move it over like I did before and get it out of the way of my pattern piece. And then I would now have a line that I can measure. I would go up to Extensions, Visualize Path, Measure Path. What's going to pop up is called a dialog box. It basically asks you to just, do you want to change any of the information for this tool? There's a few options. The one that I use the most is altering the font size. By default, I can't remember what the font size is, but it's pretty small. I find it hard to read. So I typically increase the font size. There's several other options that you can modify, including the unit that you're using to measure. I live in the United States, so I use inches, but you may use something different depending on where you live or just depending on your preferences. This is where you could edit that. And there's a few other things, I won't go into the details, otherwise I leave it as default. And then I hit apply. A box is going to pop up on top to let you know it's working, and then when that box disappears, it will now have the measurement on your path or your line. Paths and lines are the same thing. So right here, I've got my path, and now I have a measurement. Even though this dialog box is still here, I can just X out of it. So I now see that I've got 9.33 inches. The measurement is a little bit different from the line I made before, just because but they're very, very close. So I drew it 2 different occasions. I was a little more careful the first time than I was the second time. You'll probably be a little bit more careful whenever you do it. So just want to also mention, if you are calculating neckbands, for instance, or anything that where you really need to factor in seam allowances, remember, don't forget those seam allowances. For instance, I think the seam allowance on this pattern is 1/4 of an inch, and so I would just want to account for those seam allowances when I'm calculating my neckbands. And also remember, this is just half of a pattern piece, so if I was calculating a neckband for this pattern piece, I'd want to double up on these measurements because it's only counting for half of the pattern piece. So I would need to double up the front neckline measurement and also the back neckline measurement in order to get a better picture of what I need to work with, also keeping in mind those seam allowances. Anyway, this is how I use this tool. I hope you found this video helpful.